Hola, hola, señoras y señores. Bienvenidos. Welcome to a metaphysical interpretation of the Bible by Stephen L. Hairfield. Today we are beginning on page 57 and we're starting Genesis. Then God spoke to him, saying, O Brahma, I command thee, again create the world, as thou hast often done in times past. To create is to thee not new. Whatsoever it is to be created is already within me, as thou well knowest. Creation is only the projection into form, that which already exists. Bhagavatam. What if God woke up one morning and asked himself, what am I? Who am I? Is there anyone among us who has not asked those questions at least once? At times, this type of self-inquiry is necessary. It is a way to promote growth. Furthermore, nothing in this world would preclude us from thinking that the creative principle itself would possibly reflect deeply upon these simple but vital questions, especially if it was to create another side to what life already is. The leading quote above from Eastern philosophy seems to shed more light on the subject. The Creator's consciousness had no experience of self whatsoever. It was pure creative energy, yet at that point, it had created nothing of our world as we know it today. When it asked these two questions of itself, it found itself alone in that moment with no true reality or even an identity in the human or physical sense. It knew that it had life and comprehension, but there was no material representation of these attributes. It had life, but there was no life. The text of Genesis contains this implication, and it is up to us to recognize it and understand it. It tells us that there was a point in the limitless frame of infinite time where we virtually knew nothing of life. Our material reality came from this original concept, deemed today as our present birth experience. And from nothing came all things, for all things are unseen but ever present, manifested only when we define what we desire and want in our lives. When it comes to Godhead, when it comes to the Godhead must follow. When it comes, the Godhead must follow. Oh, I see a lot of highlights on this one. And so the creative principle realized that the experience is what it required to know its own true nature of being, to grasp the significance of its own self. Thus far, it had no definition, only theory, for it was not yet aware of being. One could say that it just was, and what can an inert, intangible status bring to the field of self-realization to promote forward movement? It only knew it had thought with no form. In that moment of acknowledgement, it knew that it had become an individual nature unto its own self. I am. It could be called true birth or awakening of the soul. One could even surmise that the precise moment of the divine realization in the immensity of time and space, souls were created for all living things. Whether it was a tree, a flower, an animal, it had soul substance, but no form. It automatically implies that all of life had an original creative point of energy, whether it had substance or not, at the instant of its creation. Again, we must hypothesize that in the midst of that spectral pre-creation era, there was nothing that could identify as substance or material reality, as we know it and understand it now. There was simply pure creative energy without unification. From all perspectives, energy bodies that operate under one principle, God. Even the book of Genesis does not mention physical bodies in any significant fashion until the 3rd chapter, when God made us coats of skin. This metaphor clearly portrays God's single purpose to provide spiritual, energetically based entities with a physical consciousness that we call life. God, or the creative principle, had independent aspects within its own being and was purely perfect and ethereal in its thinking. No substance, no form. At that instance of cognizance, the process that we know as a physical reality began to take shape. The Bible tells us that in the darkness, which was not yet defined, there appeared points of light and later patches of firmament. The process of definition had begun with the words, "Let there be light," giving life to God's consciousness. In the context of this initially formulated thought, darkness is the reference to the absence of understanding. Because of that, did God in the beginning truly understand as it does today? The answer is no. The appearance of light is an indication of understanding taking place within the created soul. The soul of self and God consciousness turned into reality. Reference to the firmament is our present reality becoming tangible in its thinking, or what we would term as tangible thought. If one would wish to read more on the subject, a Jewish work called the Haggadah makes mention of it. The points of definition cited above were originally not of a physical nature. They could be viewed as defined thought or defined thinking, following the recognition of consciousness from the perspective of the soul. It is as though ethereal divinity was slowly endorsing physical form. The discoveries of our modern sciences inform us in the original formation, all material planetary form was rather vaporous. This would lead one to believe that thought, in the metaphysical sense, would follow the same formative pattern. That being the case, we could describe it as hazy, unsure of itself, as a child taking its first step. These misty forms continued as gases until they drew together through the concept of swirling centers of energy, creating electromagnetic fields with their natural functions, creating thought. In turn, these centers of energetic thought swirled and condensed over so slowly, producing gravity and becoming firmer, more compact, or in other words, becoming a more defined form of thinking, a formed thought. God began to fathom the definition of its own nature, and it became the channel toward the idea of the soul. The increased comprehension of the concept of self stemmed from pure intelligence as we know and perceive it. This can be safely stated since at the time there was no sensory system from which to gain experience. However, there was pure thought beginning to operate in a more compact manner. Imagine for a moment that we as humans are without our own senses. How could we see or hear? How could we feel by touch or taste or smell? How could we arrive at any defined thought without these virtual attributes? What could we have the ability to describe the circumstances, events, or even panoramas surrounding us? Would we realize that there is anything around us at all? It would be simply pure existence, wherein we could not have the aptitude to discern ourselves from any other thing. God's experience increased in a timeless eternity, and it so did the associated knowledge. Its thoughts began to come alive, shaping an energetic form that we now term as the living soul. It began to feel. And there's some little teeny tiny writing in the bottom that makes reference to the Haggadah, and it says Haggadah or Agada in Judaism is complement to the halakha in the Talmud, the body of non-legal rabbinical lore comprising legends, anecdotes, and parables, which exemplifies the religious and ethical principles of the traditional law complied in the Talmud and Midrash during the first centuries of the Christian era. So, FYI for that. We're going to continue on with the paragraph on 60. It began to feel the desire for the creation of material form to extract more experience and wisdom from it. It wanted life and form for its consciousness. Genesis 1:26. And God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." This was for the advancement of knowledge for wisdom's sake, giving purpose to thought. Since knowledge and wisdom are attained through experience, and if we are truly in the image of God, Genesis 3:22, the man is become as one of us. Then this principle holds true for each of us as the created image. The experience is necessary for our purpose. The true learning, even about the inner soul self, and it had brought us to the point in creation, and it had brought us to that point in creation. This is why there is so much struggle and strife in the world today. God wants us to work on and remember the inner self, the forgotten first love presented in Revelation, because the outer is already perfect in its nature, and we do not seem to see or believe the latter. Instead, we believe we got shortchanged, and this is illusion. How could God, the divine perfection, make a mistake? How could it create anything less than perfect? Over the centuries, this is what we have been and are taught as a matter of conditioning. During its own process, this sublime consciousness began to realize that all it had was pure intelligence, that it must have seemed incomplete, as pure intelligence would be cold without feelings. I'm going to repeat that sentence. That must have seemed incomplete, as pure intelligence would be cold without feelings. A deeper awareness now began to evolve. We all believe that God knew all things, even in the beginning. How could this be? If we are indeed like God and we must learn, it stands to reason that it too must learn. It needed experience to understand itself. Therefore, we must do the same, as all metaphysical laws indicate and now apply from the highest to the lowest. Experience is the only real path to knowledge, and that knowledge would be relevant to both inward and outward aspects. As Spirit created the inner nature first and the outer second, the Alpha and Omega meet where we ourselves are, the true temple of Spirit. God also discovered that, as in pure intelligence, there was something lacking in pure intellect. In essence, it could not detect a sense of fulfillment. It envisioned its own intelligence and its individual concept of thought within the creation of a physical being to complete the true meaning of image and likeness of its own accord. It now had expanded its personal independent nature, and it wanted to know more, to bring itself to another level of awareness. To achieve this, it had to bring reality, physical life, to its very own mind. To achieve this, it had to bring reality, physical life, to its very own mind. As God's consciousness grew from its original perception of individual self, pure thought alone could not muster enough depth. It realized that it needed to feel what it knew, to add to its intelligence and its wisdom, allowing for more meaningful experience. However, being pure spirit without a physical nature of its own, it had no way to accomplish this task. While the intellect was already present within the soul, an attribute that can be likened to theory in our modern language, we can assume that the sense system was in the process of being formed. The latter is analogically described in the Bible as the tree of life. This physical growth would deepen humankind's experience and give it wisdom. It would have feelings and an independent nature, along with the ability to think for itself like no other creature of this world. Thus, a desire of the true physical was beginning to take shape. It had to be evolved to a greater level as it wanted to know itself in the purest sense. It recognized that it could do this through the embodied human, real events and encounters. It had to be able to feel what it knew for a more consequential self-realization expression of divine mind. What if God in that moment wanted to experience its own concept? What if the creative principle had a desire to fathom that which we call love, a love without conditions? It could not, for it had no feelings to achieve this, and it had no body to challenge it to the level of growth it had chosen. Thus, from pure thought came the concept of independent feeling. There was no connection to the thought in any way, as they were intended to be both equal in nature, as is all of life. Once more, we mention the Haggadah, in which the first attempt of feelings, independent of thoughts, is portrayed as Lilith, Adam's first companion. These concepts were too square too rebellious. They fought each other to the point where there was no potential union between these two different natures. There could be no alignment, since they were autonomous and fragmented. And then in the little tiny writing, number 2, Lilith. In post-biblical Jewish literature, Lilith came to be identified as Adam's first wife. See Alphabet Ben Sira, written between the 7th and 10th centuries. She is namelessly mentioned in Isaiah 34:14 as a demon of the desert. Emotion was then taken away, and spirit began to reconsider, were we to peer between the recorded lines? What if feelings were created out of thought as part of a thought which was Adam's attribute? What if feelings worked in conjunction with thoughts as an individual nature, yet in an interconnection, the true nature of the modern human? And so from the purest of thought came the concept of feelings as an integral part of the thinking process, which we then term as expression. It was called Eve. This amalgamation began to deepen the knowledge that is desired to comprehend even further, its own being, form, in motion. I'm gonna start that one again because I wasn't really comfortable with that read. It was called Eve. This amalgamation began to deepen the knowledge that it desired to comprehend even further, its own being and form in motion. Spirit knew the ethereal or soul part of itself, of self. And because creation had already begun and either was condensing, God knew then that it could take this process further and bring all things to material form. It knew that as thoughts were gaining life and motion, thoughts began to set into solid form, and behold, we had life ever springing forward in the now evolutional development stage. We now meet a new biblical character called the serpent, Genesis 3:1. Now the serpent was more subtle than any other beast of the field which the Lord God had made. From a metaphysical perspective, the idea of the serpent is very complex and will be intertwined in this work. This will be done because of the variety of interpretations and meanings given to this subject and how we apply and view this concept. You will find that its original intention was not evil, and how the misused ego can be shifty. You will find that its original intention was not evil, and how the misused ego can be shifty toward the physical form, especially in view of a modern sense system that has begun to overpower us. However, it seems inconceivable that God would tempt itself, unless temptation itself had a greater meaning than what has been presented to us for 1600 years in our religious conditioning. The concept of temptation was directed more toward the attainment of knowledge through the principle of learning with the sense system and the experience of living fully in Christ consciousness. We must strive to enjoy that life while being consciously aware of our personally created circumstances. The latter were intended to give us the necessary feedback on our journey into life as a physical human. We must also recognize that it is the sense system that forms the essential steps of the path itself. Such an education must be acquired through the physical aspect of life or the experience of it. Most importantly, we should never attempt to avoid it. We were meant to learn as spirit in corporal form rather than treating the lessons as spiritual on one side and physical on the other. Religions in general, but not all, have us believe that God created us to worship it. If this were true, would it not be extremely arrogant? Would it not be a gesture of control? In that case, temptation may be our very teacher of life. After all, was it not temptation that induced God to create all things? Especially in light of the chapter's opening quote. It is a statement that comes from a work much older than the Bible itself, and it is designed to be understood in a philosophical aspect. In many other texts, you would find that the serpent alludes to the rising spirit energy housed within the physical being. It dwells in all of our very spinal columns. If you wish to study this allegory further, you can find it in the Vedas, some of the oldest known spiritual writings, as well as the Buddhism text, among other references. It is also confirmed in John 3:14, and as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. As Moses was raising the spiritual nature within him to reach the wilderness of mind, this tempted our independent nature to create a physical illustration. Genesis 3:14. And the Lord God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle. Cursed above all cattle implies the importance of the serpent to the human form. God needed an opposite of itself as an anchor to hold things in place. And so the idea of Satan came into the balance. Now its thought could press itself downward into material form since it had found that anchor. Lucifer, Sanskrit translation, bright shining morning star, volunteered for the work since all things need a polar opposite for existence. It coincides with the notion of the car battery. It has two poles, and both must be used simultaneously to generate a charge, resulting in power, illumination, and the associated experience. This was the Spirit's first perception and expression of the law of opposition. Alone, it could not only produce life, since it was only one side of the concept, perhaps the positive side of the poles without the negative. At this point in time, realization was becoming much deeper. Spirit started to recognize that it needed a positive. Well, before I go to that, the Veda Sanskrit means knowledge. Also, the Samhitas, the most ancient sacred literature of all Hinduism. And we continue on page 63. Spirit started to recognize that it needed a positive and negative energy. Were not Adam and Eve the physical representation of the very same initiative? The experience it had originally begun to seek was gaining in knowledge and depth through this occurrence. The symbol of infinity is the perfect expression of polar opposites, stretching them into existence for reality to become physical so that we may have the experience we call life. This stretching effect was creating a finite form. Since there was nothing but infinity at first, what would God be without Lucifer? Man without woman, night without day, water without land, and earth without atmosphere. Infinity, as in God, recognized that an opposite action had to be used to give a foundation to life and to give certainty to physical reality. Newton's third law will tell you that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, giving credence to the fact that all things have their opposite. Harmony and truth is the action of polar oppositions, working in union with one another. And we as humans are in the center, being pulled simultaneously in opposite directions. We are the epitome of the law of polar opposites in action, of polar opposition in action. We see that Adam and Eve did not even have a truly physical form until Genesis 3:21. Unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skin and clothe them. They received bodies because they wanted to understand themselves in the expanse of infinity and because God had given life to independent thought. Further, how else would spirit be conscious of the sensate modality? For centuries, religious instructions have taught us that God literally killed animals and made coats to cover our original ancestors and keep them warm. Is this not erroneously teaching the masses that God would put to death his own creations for such a mundane purpose? Could this be a true representation of the creative principle? No, it is not. Bodies were given to us to house our souls. That part is the God within each of us. It is sad to say that we have been led away from that part. The creation of our corporal selves is confirmed in Genesis 2:5. And every plant of the field before it in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. Spirit had not yet come upon earth. It was not formed until the reality of man came into existence and was pressed down into the physical form, then perfected through the eons of time, and we knew it. As we know it. There was no physical reality until this occurred. God knows that to truly appreciate infinity, one had to be finite in nature, to experience limitation, so we could operate within the power of infinity to understand the process of the laws of opposition. Did it not give us the full charge? If we are indeed in God's image, it is apparent that at our individual stages, we are to be gods in the making. To attain this divine level, we must learn all the laws of spirit. We do this through the practice of limitation. This brings us to Genesis 2:23. And bone of my bones, man and woman were not yet physical reality, as they were still in the garden, still in spiritual form, as it was the garden itself. Conclusively, if the original garden had not yet materialized, neither had the flesh and bone forms of Adam and Eve. One was the idea of thought or the thinking attribute, and the other was the sense of feeling system, thus creating the full experience that we now have. What took place was much more esoteric. It is mentioned in many other texts such as the Vedas and Buddhism. God did not literally take a rib from Adam. It put Adam to sleep in order to remove the feminine aspect from him and form it as a separate entity. It reminds us of let there be light. This additional entity was named Eve for sensitivity as the mother of all things, the power behind conception or the power to create. Perhaps it now becomes clearer as to why the female gender gives birth to life only after the union with the masculine gender. Only then does life appear. No man may do this alone. Eve was not fashioned from a physical part of a man, but rather out of the spirit nature of self. In other words, no rib was removed, since there was no rib to remove at the time. In this ethereal form, Adam's mind experienced a sleep that was not sleep as we know it. His thinking attribute was unaware that spirit was separating the central atom of the inner soul spirit that is located at the heart center of what became the body. It was divided in half and can be considered a spiritual split rather than a physical split. This is one reason we all feel incomplete and we seek the other half, the soulmate or the twin flame, our mirror image. At first thought, this metaphysical split does not seem to fit unless we consider that at this point our physical form had not yet materialized. This did not happen until Adam and Eve tasted of the tree of knowledge. This event is recorded in the Bible when they left the Garden of Eden. This division created full thought and feelings in both male and female, along with the ability to create all things because of a divine sense system. We are to work as a union for creation purposes, both inwardly and outwardly. Yet in both respects, we work in opposition. It also created the sense of separation, or a sense of being incomplete, which spilled into the journey portrayed by the Bible, and the journey is to lead us to inner and outer union. Our search for this sense of completeness is why the majority of us struggle as we do. The Bible predicted that our search would be intensified toward the outer aspects and not our true inner quest. This prediction appears to be on target in our era. It has brought us to our contemporary continuous conflicts and appears to have gained control of us. This is illusion at its best. It has led us away from our first true love, the love for the soul rather than the body. We seek union as we are the opposite of the concept of God. The full reunion will not occur until we are the perfect inner image it has already created in its idea of image and likeness. We do not realize this perfection that is in existence within each and every one of us. Insecurity blocks this from us, and insecurity that is generated by the notion of being blinded by our own external light. We are only separate in the sense of what we may have given up. The true power of our inner combined nature, physical life, was to assist us in our own pursuit to comprehend both our corporal and spiritual sides, for we may not have one without the other. We are becoming that union in spite of ourselves as spirit continues to unfold in all its mystery, striving toward reaching the completion of one's spiritual and physical human God consciousness in the flesh. It is fully represented in the image of Christ. When Adam and Eve were formed, they brought another factor in the equation, the serpent energy. Ego is a natural influence of thought and emotion combined. It is our creative ability, and without it, we would be automatons. There would be no choice. And they tasted of the tree of knowledge, Genesis 3:5. Then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil, or light and darkness. We would know the higher and lower energies of life, and we could easily choose between them. It was not intended as good and bad as we presently interpret it. They knew the difference between spirit and physical as God did. The question is, if God truly created all things, why would it have one of its own creations tempt another? It would not, unless it had independent development as its concept, and it desired to learn about control of its own nature. It desires this for us as human corporal form. To attain God consciousness, it wants us to control all our natural attributes to create divine living, and we have not yet accomplished this. Instead, we have chosen the lower vibrations while ignoring the higher ones that are available to us at any moment in time. It is the only path to divine living and life. The creative principle wanted us to develop in a balanced nature, projected from the inner soul to the outward body. To do this, we had to know ourselves as the spirit does, thus the temptation, or possibly the first manipulation. We had to decide and exercise our power of choice. The tree of knowledge was not a sin, as we have been taught it is, for we were intended to have knowledge. That in itself certainly is not a sin, especially if we are in God's image. The tree of knowledge was the ultimate in being, allowing to understand self through the physical experience. The serpent was the ego of the self, and it now became the very key for us to expand, as well as a necessary tool for further development. It is the ego that we must understand, that we misunderstand, for it is the tool that we misuse. Today, we have regrettably given it too much influence in the realm of negativity. We have allowed it to have too much to say in the day-to-day activities of life. The ego now controls most of us, rather than influencing us toward higher levels of creative living. This is why so many people have no sense of humility. They need to be in control. This is not acceptance. It is the seat of greed and selfishness because it reigns unchecked. It will not let people be in service with and for each other. We may believe that someone needs to be in control, but it is not so, as other gospel in the Bible will tell us. This is the perfect time to introduce you to the symbol of Yin and Yang, a circle half black and half white, meaning opposites, with a small curved red line down the center that is the symbol of balance between the two. This red line represents the ego. It is the balance point between thought and emotion, the center of infinity or limitation, or the finite realm. The self chose to know more about the physical aspect of life. It wanted to be like its creator, to emulate that physically. And the task was accomplished by tasting of the fruit in the tree of knowledge. This knowledge brought about the idea of separation, meaning that humans were becoming more of a corporeal nature rather than concentrating on the infinite ability that is within them. At this point in the presentation of Genesis, they were at the transition point between the physical and the spirit nature. They were not quite there and not separate, as the spirit was being housed within the physical. They were not yet conscious that they had bodies, nor did they see the true variations between themselves. Thus they covered themselves with leaves. They were not yet conscious that they had bodies, nor did they see the true variations between themselves. Thus they covered themselves with leaves when they did realize the difference. The reality of thought pressing into the physical was taken hold. Because of the act of covering themselves, fear was introduced in the growth process. This seeming separation between self and God commenced to deepen, which is why God was searching for Adam while in the garden. Why did they hide? Were they not the first two people? No one else was going to see them. How could they know shame unless the body is a bad thing? How could that be? God created it through the knowledge already gained. This is apparent manipulation of information later disseminated to serve as control over the masses. The same as Genesis 2:23 is a way to explain creation in a world of superstition. If the creators of the Bible had attempted to explain the true definition of spirit to an already superstitious people, the religion would have been doomed. It needed a physical explanation for physical minds. Good is spirit in nature, and evil is the physical nature, since it is the lower form. We know that the writings were never intended to imply bad, as we have been taught. If it were, this would mean that God had made a mistake. How could creative perfection do this? So we had this paradox bound within us, that it is not to say that we are evil, for evil does not really exist except in the mind of the individual nature of the human. Evil is a matter of choice that we are to constantly overcome because of our ego. Our options must be the original sin, choice, yet it is a difficult one. We are in Spirit's image, and that must mean in all ways. According to the early superstitions world, we are evil because we are physical. We believe that everything we do must be physical in nature. Not so, as the Ark of the Covenant travels before you, a point which we elucidate later. In truth, our actions are only the end result of everything spiritual. Evil, in the sense that is being applied here, does not mean that we are bad unless we choose to be. Evil is only stated to mean a physical nature that cannot think past the physical state. It also means ignorance in spiritual matters, not allowing God in our being or in our inner reality and not just our mind. This is the sense of separation from oneness. At a later time, Jesus expressed that thought reported in Matthew 7:11. We will cover this matter in the pertinent chapter. And so God accomplished its dream of definition. It had materialized a corporal entity through which it could experience things that a celestial deity could not. It had created them in its image and likeness to augment its wisdom and its spiritual nature. Today we call these complex physical beings humans. The creative principle gave them a sense state system so that it and they could enjoy all the wonders of life and the universe. It gave them the power to think and to choose. Under these premises, it shared itself with each of them, giving them the opportunity and the tools to travel the path to spirituality and God consciousness. However, they now had bodies with which to distract themselves, by which they became enamored. They could touch and sense the touch of another. The feelings were overwhelming and quickly took precedence over the heart, soul, and spirit that resided within these mortal shells. The first warning of this empowering physical nature came with the advent of Cain and Abel, and that warning was that we should not allow the physical to dominate life as it has. The story of the brothers in Genesis clearly tells us and cautions us about a fact that it would appear not only controls us, but owns us. Cain was a worker of the earth, very physical, even in the descriptions. Symbolically, is the first indication that physical will become our most important feature, and such aspect will slay the spiritual every time, except in very few cases. Cain slew Abel, a shepherd who tended the flocks. Biblically, shepherds were traditionally wise men, the thinkers of that era, for they herded their thoughts or controlled them and had them focused toward a higher purpose. They were much more oriented in spiritual matters. Today, as it was then, most of us pay little attention to the spiritual. We still have not accepted the concept of oneness. Our inner character began to struggle with itself, and that struggle still goes on to this day as the underlying current of material discord. That tussle is really between dark and light, between understanding and the lack thereof, between body and soul, the masculine and feminine energies of all life. It is that internal nature of polar opposites that gives us the knowledge we have through the external experiences of life. In Genesis, we are learning of our own individual nature of self and the challenges involved in being a spirit in physical form. The Bible describes the journey of the soul as it travels into and out of life after life. It describes the true path of our experiences in self, how we are to return to God or the higher self, and how we are to trust it always. It also relates what will occur if we do not behave in this fashion. In reality, how much of it do we trust? How can any of us trust something that we cannot see and cannot feel in the physical sense of the word? As it has been for eons, the mission of this life is to get in touch with that higher self, and it has always been this way. It has been since the dawn of what we term as linear time. For our rudimentary beginnings, the spread of knowledge was set in motion. Thus we are the accumulation of that knowledge today. Our DNA is our personal history of our own tree of life and the record of experience. It is our book of life, as mentioned in the book of Revelation, and we are not to open its seven seals and we are to open its seven seals to sense the complete journey of the soul. We are still working on bringing this journey to fruition through the day-to-day events of life. What God had created was a mirror of its own self-perception, bearing the likeness of its perfection. The divine in physical form. We do not seem to recognize that perfection of self is us. God did not commit any error. We are the ones that discern it, because it is how we judge our personal journey. We were and are perfect in all ways and attributes. We are the individual incarnation of the power of divine creation. In the beginning, we were originally fashioned out of divine perception and not out of reality, and we could not have known that much in that way of experience. The descending genealogical listings found in the Bible are not just names, but also correspond to the different generational developments It took us to grow into more physical reality. You see, according to the book of Jasher and other ancient chronicles, we never left the Garden of Eden. We just think we have, merely because of the inner separation that most of us sense. We just changed it into something other than what it originally and initially it was. Let me go back. We just think we have, merely because the inner separation that most of us sense. We just changed it into something other than what is originally and initially. It was esoteric by its very nature. We changed it to match our corporal selves, thus giving it a physical or material explanation while moving it from the truth. This is the true birth of physical knowledge. As it took place, the garden also had to become physical. It had to materialize as the flora and fauna that were to support us as humans. We have come to call it the earth, the world in which we reside. We have looked for this garden, but we have been searching in the wrong places. Genesis 2:10 through 14 tells us, "And a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from thence it was parted and became into 4 heads." The biblical description has been thought by many to be located in the Kashmir region of the Far East and the northern part of India today. This is why it is the cradle of true ancient knowledge and why so many masters come from this area of our present world. It is also why Jesus himself journeyed there to learn from this great source of information. Beside biblical texts verifying this location, there are other works that confirm this theory, such as Jesus Lived in India by Holger Kirsten. We might add at this point that the spiritual implications of this garden may consider the heart of the human as the true garden. It can be explained that the energy of God flows into this part of life and splits into 4 rivers of sorts to the rest of the body, giving it life. It is the journey into the physical as we strive towards the ultimate living humans with equal spiritual orientation. Each book of the Old Testament is a record of our experience. Each book of the Old Testament is a record of our experience at and during that period of time. We see that in who we begat, whom and how long each one lived. They were different levels of experience through which we were developing and how long that level lasted, given in the age of each descendant. In short, it shows our soul growth or evolvement in physical form. Allow us for a moment to move in another minor direction, because at the point of creation, all souls were formed at the same time with the world as we know it. All individual soul energy was unleashed and began to grow. The Big Bang. Life started as a reality of divine thought from involution to evolution to attain the experience necessary for further wisdom. We reenact the slaying of Abel by his brother day in and day out. With our own internal selves, we are constantly slaying the spiritual aspect to pursue the physical. It is so because we give all importance to the material side and not to the whole self, as was originally intended. We see this confirmed in Genesis 4:6 through 7. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou dost well, shall thou not be accepted? And if thou dost not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Does this not sound like the misused ego? Perhaps it is the very first sign of jealousy or insecurity, and he must master it, as do we all. We were whole at one point, until the metaphor of the incident between Cain and Abel. There will always be a struggle between what we feel and what we think about a particular subject, between the soul and the form. The misunderstood ego will ensure this. The Master taught us that we should match what we think with what we feel and not the other way around. On a daily basis, we attempt to match what we feel to what we think And that has to be quite frustrating because it usually does not match. By then, the inner struggle is raging within. Thinking is physical and feeling is spiritual, creating a division on inner levels. Very seldom are they in complete agreement on any issue. Adam and Eve are these very differences within our own selves, and they become manifest in physical life as the polar opposites of self, where we learn to reconcile these natures within the self, and we have yet to do so, since we always give importance to the mindful things in life. This may have the tendency to move us away from the feeling of life. The essence that encapsulates the rationale of the first struggle and its biblical allegory. We see this very same struggle symbolized throughout the Bible, yet we do not understand this very simple message of inner peace and union that is also portrayed in the same work of art. This lack of comprehension is due to the fact that we think that what we think is much more important to us. It has to be, since what we think is what makes us who we are. It gives us our viewpoints on issues, and we will do everything to protect them with great inflexibility. We do not very easily allow for new ways of thinking about issues, since we are repetitious in our thought processes, and Jesus himself stated we should avoid this. We believe that the old will contaminate the new, or vice versa. The Master told us of this predicament in his analogy of the new wine placed in old skins. Contamination will take place, for we do not release old beliefs very easily. It seems to be the innate nature of the humans to stay in place on old, outdated modes of thought, and it binds them further with the esoteric collision. Genesis 7:15 through 19. And they went into Noah, into the ark, 2 and 2 of all flesh, wherein is Genesis 7:15 through 19. And they went in unto Noah into the ark, 2 and 2 of all flesh, wherein is the breath of life. 16. And they that went in male and female of all flesh, as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. 17. And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth. 18. And the waters prevailed, and they were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. 19. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. We are told of Noah and the deluge of rain for a period of 40 days and 40 nights, and the flood. Geological science does not confirm this occurrence, yet many other religions have recorded the event. Conclusively, there must be another underlying metaphysical explanation for it. As was mentioned earlier, metaphysically speaking, water is related to the flowing spiritual nature. This metaphor is that spirit was coming back into full play to influence the body on a deeper esoteric level. It would seem that for an initial period, earth was deluged by spirit blanketing all things. What happened? A shift of the ages, if you will, occurred to take us from a physical nature back to a more spiritual one. It was a transition after the garden by several thousand years, and biblically the second time it had to occur. Adam and Eve were the first from spirit to physical. Noah was the second from physical back to spiritual. Allow us to explain the rather complex notion of the flood and the shift of the ages. Ancient prophecy tells us that such a shift of consciousness period occurs every 3,000 to 4,000 years, and we call it a polar shift, a function of electromagnetism. We see a direct reference to this possibly in Joshua 10:13. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. It must also be stated that the Mayan texts record a period of extended darkness for about a day. It appears to have happened during the same period of time. the darkness on the other side of the earth and confirms what took place in the east. From a geological point of view, this shift has been recorded before on 6 different occasions as a magnetic shift of the poles. No one knows specifically what occurs during global upheavals. This possibility may also tend to explain the different ice ages that have come and gone. Unless the sun was to diminish its ability to heat the earth, there is no other explanation for our planet to be covered in ice and snow, and at different points in time. If the earth were to change its position or shift on its axis, this would then cause the ice caps to be in entirely different latitudes and longitudes. If one is interested, this information is geologically verifiable. The poles are a function of an electromagnetism, and ironically, so is the human form, especially the idea of mind and thought. When these shifts happen, we go from the left brain logic to right brain creativity and spiritual consciousness. It is a reminder of who we are, balancing this event in our field of experience. Ancient prophecy also states that we will go from a patriarchal society to a matriarchal society. This allegory moves from a physical life to living from and through the experience of the soul. We are witnessing this globally in the very fabric of civilization, thus the wars and rumors of wars, the process of the release of the old. This is very exciting. We just have a few more moments to go. Let me see how many pages. Are we going to be able to finish this tonight, or am I going to have to continue? Because as you can tell, when I get to reading, it starts getting super shaky. Okay, there's quite a few pages left in this chapter, so I'm just going to go ahead for what I can. All right. This concept is carried even further by one of the fathers of the laws of physics, Dr. Albert Einstein. He states that the time is not truly linear, but rather it is an arc or curve. We know that an arc or curve is part of a circle or cycle, and it will return to the point of origination whence it began. We can apply the same concept with the use of the term wheels, which we find in Ezekiel 1:19 through 21. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. 20. Whithersoever the spirit was to go, they went thither. Was their spirit to go, and the wheels were lifted up over against them? For the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. 21. When those went, these went. And when those stood, these stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up over against them. For the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. During periods of pure material reality, we use the left brain as primary function, and the logic prevails. After a shift of the electromagnetic fields, we predominantly use the right brain that is more metaphysically oriented through such action as creativity and intuition. It expands the sensory system of the otherwise physical human and brings higher levels of consciousness. The functions of the left and right brain are also laws of oppositions within, as thought and emotions are. The assets called creativity and intuition are more predominant at that point than at any other time, but logic will not necessarily operate as our usual level. It makes sense that we must learn to operate with both sides of the brain at the same time rather than rely on one side and then the other. To go through life in that manner would bring us an invaluable experience. We would become aware of the illusion of our dual nature, and it would open the doors to creation, thus unifying the duality. Indeed, whole growth would take place, and the duality we think is there, the duality we think is there would disappear. It would become unified as one and the same, and it truly has been and is unified, except in our everyday thought processes. We separate ourselves through the idea of logical thought and mind. We do this for the obvious reason that we see the material side and not the other. Therefore, one is real and the other is an illusion, as logic would indeed dictate. We have it exactly backward, as we are the fingerprint of the soul, the external. The shift of poles is to ultimately bring infinite reality as our mode of operation. Christ consciousness is the end result. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and I'm stopping on page 75. And I just want to say that this is a very exciting read for me because it is the confirmation of the times that we're in. And we know that everything is coming back to balance. It is happening now. And that's why it's so important that we maintain our vibration at the highest level possible, because this is happening right now. And so this ending, it had to be an ending so that there could be a rebirth. And we are coming into a whole new existence where we exist in balance, peace, and love and harmony. That is absolutely real. It is attainable and accessible, and it is happening in our lives right now, in this very moment, as we speak. What we're creating in our minds and thoughts is what we're creating in our lives. So this was just, it hit the spot. It hit the spot. It's what I needed. And I will definitely be coming back. There's only a few more pages left to this chapter. So we're going to finish that up. It'll probably take me, I don't know, maybe about 20, 30 minutes to finish up the next pages. And then we're going to go into Isaiah. Faith is to believe in what we do not see. And the reward of faith is to see what we believe. Ooh, I can't wait. I'm excited for that one. So stay tuned for the next one, and I will be feeling you guys soon. Adios.